Today's episode is brought to you by Raisin UK, the free online savings platform with exclusive savings accounts from over 40 FSCS-protected banks and building societies. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link in the show notes or go to raisin.co.uk/pensioncraft. Since the sweeping reforms of the 1980s, China's rapid industrialisation and extraordinary growth have transformed it into a true global power. But the engine of China's economic miracle is starting to sputter. Sluggish demand, mounting debt, and unfavourable demographics suggest trouble ahead.
Our guest today is George Magnus, who has written extensively on the risks facing China. And in today's Dumb Question of the Week, we ask, can we trust China's economic statistics? All right, let's get into it. Today, we're delighted to be joined by George Magnus, a leading expert on China and the global economy at large. George is a research associate at the University of Oxford's China Centre and the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He was previously chief economist and senior economic advisor at major investment banks and brings decades of experience riding out the boom and bust cycles of financial markets. Thanks so much for joining us, George.
Thanks for having me.
So 6 years ago, you published the book Red Flags: Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. Now, looking at the economic challenges facing China today, are they playing out as you anticipated?
Well, I have to confess, the one thing I didn't anticipate in 2018 was COVID. And although I don't think that the outcome of what has happened in China since COVID would have materially been different. In other words, the red flags that I was kind of alluding to and drawing attention to in the book, I think would have played out and would have been problematic anyway. But it's quite clear that COVID played a major part in bringing everything forward and exacerbating underlying problems which pre-existed. But in a nutshell, I would say 6 years on, Xi's China is in jeopardy. I mean, obviously, there have been a lot of things that we need to comment on, and perhaps we will now, the successes that China has had in terms of its industrial policy and in being a sort of a leader in green and other advanced technologies. But yeah, I think the economy is in trouble.
Well, we'll forgive you for not predicting COVID.
Very
But
kind.
what were the red flags that you thought were there and are still there?
Well, I mean, the principal ones really were China's incapacity to carry more debt forever. In other words, the debt burden had been rising so quickly that I thought there were going to be limits to how much further or how much more juice, China could actually squeeze out of rising indebtedness in the state and local government sectors. Another red flag was the currency, which I thought was going to be a problem for them to manage in the wake of difficult to manage capital outflows, but also the fact that it was approaching a point where interest rates were going to have to be cut because of incipient deflation. I wasn't particularly impressed by what I saw going on with regards to the prioritization of the state sector vis-a-vis private enterprises and the governance changes that were giving rise to that. The external environment, trade sanctions, export controls, these were, again, only kind of embryonic when I wrote the book, but it was pretty clear which way things were going to go, Trump or no Trump. I think those are the principal ones, really. I mean, real estate, of course, is just a subsector, I thought, or wrote in the book as a subsector of the whole kind of indebtedness problem. But real estate has taken on a life of its own, really, so that overbuilding in real estate and in infrastructure are kind of clear examples of chronic resource misallocation. And so far, there's been no strategy, really, for allocation of costs and, who picks up the tab. And you can't really move on until you clear this kind of financial mess up, as we find out too.
So given the fact that they'll probably be trying to deleverage very carefully, do you think that China could be headed for some kind of balance sheet recession?
I know this has been often mentioned, Ramin, particularly in the context of Richard Koo's very timely work when he was writing about this for Japan. I don't think it's identical because actually the private sector in China is not really affected by kind of balance sheet stress and decay in the way that Japanese private firms were in the 1990s and 2000s. The balance sheet problems really are owned by local governments and by state enterprises. So it's not quite the same. But I think that the presence of these problems in China, even though in kind of a more limited range of sectors, I think is a difficult workout and doesn't excuse the absence of a strategy to allocate, to allow bad assets to fall into stronger hands and for misallocated capital to be written off, costed, and so on. I mean, financial mess always has to be cleaned up one way or the other. And the Chinese don't really like the instability that this would give rise to. I mean, one of the mantras that Chinese leadership has is really about, they crave stability, right? They don't want to invite or run the risk of causing chaos in the financial system through procedures and initiatives that they don't think they can control.
I suppose one kind of similarity with Japan in the 1980s was that at that time, Japan was very much a leader in technological industries and was at the forefront. As you could argue, China is now in things like solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, drones. They've got a head start there. But we saw Japan fall away from the cutting edge, more or less, as the balance sheet recession played out. Could that happen to China, even though it's got this head start?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because there's been a lot of discussion, particularly recently, about whether Xi Jinping's or the Chinese Communist Party's investment in, on an unprecedented scale, really, in industrial policy and in the creation of green technologies and advanced science and engineering will be the ticket to success. And it's very interesting because actually I came across a very interesting essay in the International Affairs Foreign Relations magazine called Foreign Affairs, which was written by the dean of Johns Hopkins University in about 1987, 1988. I can't remember exactly which year, in which if you took out the word Japan and inserted the word China, it could almost have been written like yesterday or today because it expresses its concern that effectively Japan's leading brands in science and engineering and technology were basically going to dull America's competitive edge and consign it to playing second fiddle in the global economy, and just a very kind of paranoid view about Japan's rise, which was on the verge of actually coming unstuck pretty quickly.
They call that the magazine indicator, don't they?
Yeah, a little bit like that. And I think, although I don't think that the Chinese situation today is identical in every respect to Japan in 1989, 1990, this likeness actually is really, really interesting. So China has world leadership, global brands in EVs, batteries, electrical storage, wind and solar. Maybe next will be hydrogen. So this whole green revolution is on such a scale, and the Chinese are so far ahead in it that it's tempting to think that this is going to be a kind of a killer for the rest of the world in terms of Chinese industrial supremacy. But it's very easy to forget that these modern sectors are quite small relative to the size of the economy. So if you look at what the Chinese define as strategic emerging industries, which includes all the things that I mentioned, plus a few others, I mean, you're still only talking about sort of 8 or 9% of GDP. And the real estate and infrastructure sectors, which we've alluded to, which are in trouble, are at least maybe, 3 times that amount. So it's the vast areas of the economy, the macroeconomy, that are basically suffering from imbalances and misallocation of capital, which are contrasted with this highly efficient kind of modern sector that doesn't actually employ a lot of people. And China has two groups of labor markets which are really in serious trouble. One is the graduate market, and the other is the migrant labor market. But that's the dichotomy is you've got islands of technological excellence, but a sea of macroeconomic trouble.
So in terms of solutions, a lot of people, well, including President Xi, are talking about switching to a consumption-led economy. Now, in order to achieve that, clearly they're not going to be able to stimulate the supply side. So how do you think they could turn things around? And is it possible even in a realistic time frame?
Well, I think, Ryan, the problem is in the language that you used, which I'm not blaming you for, but you said switching to consumption. I don't think, I'd have to check, but I don't think I could pinpoint or locate any reference in which Chinese leaders have talked about switching from industrial policy or from investment to consumption. They do talk about strengthening consumption demand, for example, as they did most recently at the annual Central Economic Work Conference that took place in December. And not for the first time, by the way, because they've spoken about this before. But I would say there are two things that are a little bit kind of iffy about this. The first is they don't talk about we want to promote consumption because we think we've overinvested, therefore we need to change the model to switch the allocation of resources away from investment towards consumption. They don't talk about that. They talk about strengthening consumer demand, but in the same breath, they talk about continued emphasis and commitment to investment and the efficiency of investment. So it's talking out of kind of two sides of the mouth, really. The second thing is, when they do talk about consumption, they think the problem is there's not enough opportunities for people to spend money. In other words, they see it as a sort of a supply issue. Like if we enhance the supply of goods and services on offer to consumers, like greater opportunities for tourism, more opportunities to trade old consumer durables in for new ones and so on and so forth. If we do these kinds of things, then, things will be better. But they won't really, because that's not the problem in China. The problem in China is income growth isn't enough to fuel or to sustain higher rates of consumption growth at the expense of investment. And until or unless they actually embrace that as the core problem, so in other words, if the diagnosis isn't correct, they're not going to get the right solutions, to be honest.
Is a problem that also goes alongside that they don't have a particularly strong welfare state, as I understand it, or pension system. And so people are very cautious about the future and not willing to spend in the present.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually, Michael. I think it's, in fairness, there is a fairly universal system of pension payments, but it is quite a skinny system. The pension benefit to final salary are, quite ungenerous, I would say. The healthcare system still relies on people meeting quite a lot of out-of-pocket expenses as part of their healthcare needs. And obviously, hundreds of millions of migrant workers don't get access to public goods and services and social insurance and so on and so forth. So reform of the urban registration system obviously is quite an important thing that they need to do as well, but nobody really wants to pay for it. And they do have a goal for 2025 of raising pension benefits for citizens. So it's not like it's being ignored, but it's not really enough, really, to stop people from saving. I mean, obviously, the inadequacy of the welfare system is part of the reason that people save such a high proportion of their income.
So just going back to the economy, we've clearly seen weakening growth over the last few years and even deflation. Over the last 6 to 12 months, the Communist Party has rolled out a range of stimulus measures, as I understand it, mostly on the monetary side. Are they going to be effective? Is it enough to turn this around?
Post-COVID, which is to say in 2023 and in the first half of 2024, a number of measures were rolled out, incremental measures to basically help the housing market, try to keep the developers afloat, even Evergrande and Country Garden and others that basically probably should have been wound up They've been on sort of a slow death row, watch rather than being wound up and assets disposed and so on. So there have been quite a lot of measures taken out or been announced to try to stabilize things, but not really succeeded. And so in July, August, September, early October of last year, it was quite clear the government was spooked. So we saw quite a lot of stuff happen, lower interest rates, lower reserve requirements for banks, increased subsidies to state enterprises to buy up uncompleted housing, in a big program of buybacks and liquidity to help boost the stock market, which was quite successful for a number of weeks, although since then markets have been kind of treading water for the most part.
I remember at the time people were talking about a big bazooka, but in hindsight it seems like a sort of medium-sized bazooka.
Well, not big bazooka in the sense that I think people were expecting, because what they wanted, I think the investment banks keep talking about, expecting the big bazooka, which is what they mean by that is a huge fiscal stimulus. That's not happened. In fact, the limits to which the government has gone is to essentially allow local governments to spend unutilized funds at the end of last year to raise the fiscal deficit this year, 2025, by maybe 1% of GDP. And to spend roughly 10 to 12 trillion yuan, which is quite a lot of money, but really on financial engineering. In other words, by doing debt swaps with local governments. So they get out of some of their more expensive bank debt or more expensive bonds, and they substitute it with cheaper debt. And of course, as you know, long-term interest rates in China are now little more than 1.5%. So what's missing there, though, is what we conventionally would describe as the big bazooka, which is like big cleanup operation, like a TARP, so the Americans did after Lehman, plus maybe, 3 or 4, 5% of GDP in terms of fiscal stimulus to boost consumption. That kind of stuff, I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, if Xi Jinping was party to our podcast today, he would probably say, we're doing stimulus already. We're spending billions of yuan in terms of industrial policy subsidies and below market borrowing to allow companies like BYD and Geely and all the other kind of EV producers and CATL and all the battery producers and goodness knows who else to basically Huawei, so that they can become high quality GDP generators. So that would, I think, be the CCP's argument, which is to say, we're not interested in kind of incremental consumer spending. We're interested in creating this kind of all singing, all dancing, powerful industrial economy from which the trickle-down benefits will spread as night follows day, is what they would say and probably believe. And obviously, we tend to take a different view about this. Not just Western economists, I would say, but also there have been some celebrated cases of Chinese economists who've been brave enough to publish, and sometimes they have their work taken down pretty quickly, but to publish, quite significant criticism implicitly of the government's strategy in this regard.
I don't imagine most other countries around the world, certainly in the West, are going to be happy with a further boosting of Chinese overcapacity.
Yeah.
And, they're running a huge trade surplus, especially with America. And this is, I guess, the reason we've got these tariffs coming.
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen whether Trump's bark is as big as his bite and so on. And the thing about being unpredictable is nobody can really say, whether these tariff threats are designed more for rhetorical impact and negotiation, or whether from early on in this year, once he returns to the White House formally, whether there's going to be a kind of a full-on campaign against Chinese products through tariffs. So nobody knows for sure exactly how Trump's tariff policy will be framed and how it will evolve. But there's no question that the pushback, not just in the United States, but in the EU and also amongst other countries in the so-called global south, like Brazil and India, Turkey, even countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, for example, there is pushback because people and countries do perceive that they are experiencing costs associated with For a number of countries, it could be EVs and batteries, for example, or for other countries, it could be steel or aluminum and other Chinese products. But yes, it is a short answer to your question that this kind of industrial policy mercantilist emphasis, which is resulting in this kind of trade shock 2.0 of soaring Chinese export surpluses, is beginning to have a negative effect on a number of hitherto unexpected countries. So it is likely to become more significant, I would say, in the future.
So is the solution, and this seems to be America's solution, to become mercantilist itself? And obviously for countries like the UK, that'll be tricky. But are we all mercantilists now?
Well, I don't think that's correct to say that, because I think, strictly speaking, the practice of mercantilism really is actually a negation of the original free trade principles of comparative advantage, right? So the idea of comparative advantage in free trade is that you specialize in doing certain things because you're good at them, and then you import the stuff that you're not so good at because other people are better at doing those things and so on. So that's the kind of the mutually beneficial arrangement of free trade. I think China is different. It's not the only country that practices kind of mercantilist policies. You could also say that, Germany does. You could say that South Korea does. But they do this on a much smaller scale. But China obviously is important because A, it's the second biggest economy in the world, and B, because it dominates global exports and global supply chains and global manufacturing. And I think we kind of single out China because of its size and scale, and because obviously in many ways it's an adversary. And we single them out because their industrial policies basically impose consequences on other countries, particularly in this case the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, etc., which they didn't really ask for and which they don't really have a chance to compete back on. I mean, I recognize that obviously what we are doing in the West is to impose our own protectionist measures against what we regard as Chinese protectionism. And in some respects, we are all becoming industrial policy countries, or trying to, although we're never going to do it on the scale that China is practicing it. I mean, if you want to kind of push the argument to the limit and say, well, we're all mercantilists now, you could say that, but I don't think it's fair.
It's a good headline.
Yes, it is. But I don't think it's fair to castigate, or to tar everybody with this brush. The rest of us wouldn't be in this position were it not for the scale of Chinese export policy and industrial policy in the first place.
I suppose some people worry about the end game for this. If China comes to completely dominate global manufacturing at the expense of the West's manufacturing capacity, if we had a military conflict with China, either directly or by proxy, they can just outproduce us and win the war, basically.
Yes, I mean, obviously, we kind of presume, certainly based on the experience that we've had in the last century of 2 world wars, that actually industrial prowess kind of wins out in the end. To be honest, I don't really know about Cold War 2.0 or, a Third World War, and actually what the critical success factors will be. I mean, clearly, China does have the capacity to do things in industry which we have outsourced, neglected, can't do as well, etc., etc. But now you have to have a kind of a discussion about the nature of future warfare and...
Yeah. I mean, I look at their beautiful drone displays, right? And I say, that's very pretty. Oh, no, it's not going to be that pretty in the future.
No, well, and also, I mean, from a distance, because it's just obviously not my expertise, but I kind of read what sort of military strategists say, particularly based on what's going on in Ukraine, about the role of drones in warfare compared with missiles and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't really know what the kind of critical success factors will be in the next, if there is conflict. But I would say that what we see going on now is a response to not only China's command of a third of global manufacturing value added, which is what they account for, but also the unwillingness on the part of a growing number of countries to accept the implications of building on that one-third base. My hunch would be that, even though I don't think he got everything right, Biden's industrial policy initiatives are basically the foothills of where the rest of us are going to try to get to over the next 5 or 10 years.
This episode is brought to you by Raisin UK, the simple, streamlined savings marketplace. Choose from a wide variety of savings accounts. You can find everything from easy access accounts to fixed-term bonds with competitive interest rates. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link in the show notes or go to raisin.co.uk/pensioncraft. Now, obviously there are huge economic problems in China, but some people could see this as an opportunity because obviously Chinese stocks have re-rated downwards massively. So do you think that actually could be an opportunity, assuming that China does eventually improve things?
You just loaded your question with the answer because you said, assuming that China does eventually improve things. By definition, I would say that if China were to adopt something more than, cyclical fine-tuning, then the prospects for demand growth in China, income growth, and everything that would flow from that, by definition, I would say that that would improve the economic outlook to the extent that there's a relationship between the stock market and the economy, which is perhaps always a little bit kind of tenuous. My inclination would then to be yes. I think then the relative cheapness of Chinese equities would come into its own. But there are kind of at least two caveats to that. The first is that the assumption that this is the way that Chinese policy will evolve, I think, is questionable. I think, there will be changes to Chinese policy. I think we will have some measures to stimulate consumption. We will have a bigger kind of fiscal deficit in 2025. But I doubt very much whether this will have staying power because I really don't believe that the Chinese government is intent on changing things in the way that investment banks and investors would like to think. From their perspective, I think China's leaders are probably pretty happy with the way things are going, or at least satisfied. The second caveat is that if you look back at the past on the aggregate indices like CSI 300 or the Shanghai Composite, you get two spikes, really, really violent spikes in the Chinese market. One back at the end of the 2000s and one in 2015-16, both of them followed by precipitous busts. And then for most of the time, the markets just trade ranges and they visit the top of the range, they go to the bottom of the range. They're really kind of directionless. Now, that's not to say that if you're a stock picker, you can't find great Chinese stocks in which to invest. And so I'm sort of macroeconomics rather than stock picking. But
we're all stock pickers, come on, at heart.
Yeah, deep down we are, yeah. I suppose you're right. So I think if you know about liquidity in China and you know how to get in and out and you trust the information you're getting, which of course is becoming more problematic because of the clampdown on information, corporate information, due diligence and so on, then, yeah, there are probably companies that you could, add to your portfolio, set price targets, get out when you think is good opportunity. But my impression is that it's not really a market for retail investors. Not really. You can be lucky, like last September, October, you had this huge rally in the market after the kind of stock market buybacks and liquidity for buying shares, plus the other interest rate and monetary measures that were mentioned. But again, since then, as probably we said right at the beginning, market's been sort of treading water since then. Hasn't had a very good start to this year, although, it's only a few days old. So I just think you want to be really careful about Chinese stocks.
It just seems like it's a binary option in a way, because if they do decide to actually break relations with the West completely and maybe even step it up to military conflict, you could end up in a situation like Russia where your capital's just frozen.
Yeah.
So I think that risk is probably a material risk for some investors. And like you say, I think for most retail investors, China is probably off bounds. Do you think that China actually cares at all about its stock market?
I think they care about the bad vibes, that a slumping market gives, because it casts China and Chinese companies, it just casts it all in a very negative light. So I think they have been in the past minded to act when things have gotten out of hand. So they did it obviously in 2015, 16, sent in the national team to prop up the market. They've kind of done it again in the autumn of last year. And I think provided the market is kind of behaving itself, I don't think they care too much about it. Were things to deteriorate again, as in becoming a one-way street on the downside, I think they probably would step in again to try to support it, yeah. Because that actually puts a lot of financial institutions, particularly non-banking financial institutions, at risk.
I mean, I guess my fear with investing in a large Chinese company is that if it gets very successful, there are two big, powerful parties willing to hit it with a big stick. Either the Chinese Communist Party, we've seen them beat up their own tech companies, or America is not going to be happy when Huawei starts, rolling out 5G in Britain and tried to block it, So you have to get a company that both the US and the Chinese Communist Party are happy to let grow.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a sort of a binary thing from a geopolitical point of view. I take your point about it. Companies, are not supposed to become like Alibaba and Jack Ma and so on and so forth, because that would be to compete with the CCP. And of course, private companies are welcome to make money and, receive the support and the encouragement of the party, provided they toe the line and fulfill party obligations along with commercial obligations. There's a lot of discussion about whether in some areas of green technology, let's say, that the Chinese are so far ahead that the Europeans or the Americans would be foolish not to allow Chinese companies to invest locally to produce goods that would benefit the American or the European economy. Now, you may not want to do that with electric vehicles because, computers on wheels, data transfer, all this kind of stuff could be very, very sensitive. But there are a lot of, solar panels, wind turbines, and the kind of the hardware that goes into manufacturing. Some people think that's not something that we should necessarily shun. So provided conflict is kept at arm's length, which we must all hope, obviously, it will in perpetuity. But then, there probably are commercial interactions and exchanges which are still possible, which would benefit Chinese companies and which would be reflected, one imagines, in their valuations. So horses for courses, definitely. I'm not a big fan of buying the Chinese market, but I think there may be companies that can benefit from, the increasingly transactional way in which, policy will be conducted between now and the next 4 or 5 years.
If they're allowed to become true multinationals, then yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I often talk about in the videos that I make about the economy in China is talking about demographics and the fairly shocking statistic, which is that it is now quite a rapidly aging economy. Do you think that's going to be a headwind for growth for China? And will that pose problems for the government?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a uniquely Chinese problem. It just happens to be a problem in China because, as I think you alluded to, it probably is the fastest aging country on earth if you measure it by, for example, the change in the old age dependency ratio. So the proportion of over 60s or over 65s relative to the working age population. So in China, you've got rapidly rising cohorts of older people, falling working age population. In that sense, it is a problem. Is it a drag on growth? Unquestionably. So roughly every 1% change in the working age population corresponds to about a 1% reduction in potential growth. Unless you can increase, obviously, the quality of your labour force over time by equipping them with better skills, education, training, etc., etc. Is it the most urgent problem the Chinese have got? No, I don't think it is. I think they have time to address the issues. There are only a limited number of ways in which you can offset the impact of aging on your economy. One is to have much higher levels of immigration. That's not going to happen. The second is to increase the participation of people who are typically underrepresented, which would be women and older workers. That's a dubious kind of set of criteria for China because they are in the process of changing pension eligibility age, but it's from a very low base of 60 for men and 55 to 60 for women. And it's going to take place over like 20 years. So it's such a slow incremental shift that it probably isn't going to have a huge impact, certainly for the foreseeable future. Ultimately, the way you kind of address it is going to be through productivity. So if tomorrow's labour force is, 10% more productive than today's, you've kind of solved the problem of diminishing working age population and higher implicit costs of pensions and healthcare and so on. But the problem is, it comes back to what we've been talking about before, that the development model isn't really working anymore and productivity has stalled and the government doesn't really have a macroeconomic strategy to address it.
So the China miracle has come to a stop and they've joined the ranks of every other country desperate for productivity growth.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think we should be churlish about saying that China's kind of stalled out completely. In relative terms, I think it has. So relative to its global size maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and relative to the US, I think it's probably going to make heavy going of the future. But obviously, its GDP will continue to increase and, one imagines that income per head is going to continue to rise, but not on the scale that I think was once imagined.
Now, over the years, I learnt a lot about economics and how it affects markets from George. And if you in turn want to learn from us, then why not join our community? You can learn more, just go to pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, can we trust China's economic statistics?
No.
All right, wrap it up.
Okay, so the slightly dumb but not so dumb answer is really, in the first place, a lot of statistics and a lot of data that we used to get full and open access to, we can't anymore. So they just don't allow it. There's also a huge clampdown on what analysts and economists and market people are allowed to say. You're just not allowed to badmouth or criticize.
Didn't they ban the word deflation from officials for a while?
Not sure about that, but it's not implausible. And then there's the whole thing about GDP. So, when you talk about GDP in China, we kind of think it's like any other country in the world, but it's not. It's unique because most countries add up GDP at the end of the year and say, this is what happened. The Chinese do it the other way around. They basically set a GDP target and they say it's going to be met. And normally it is, even though actual growth in activity sometimes bears no resemblance at all to what the GDP numbers say.
Is it true that the central government sets this as a target for local government and it's then their job to kind of rustle up growth numbers that meet their target locally?
Yes. So local and provincial governments actually are the agents that deliver not just public goods and services, but economic growth effectively. So 2024, growth target was about 5%. And the numbers will show that China got either at 5 or plus or minus 5. As sure as I'm telling you this, that's the way it's going to be. But actually, if you drill down to the things that we know things about, and we've got other sort of data sources to try to look at, we probably struggle to get something that's half as big as that, actually.
Are they just targeting an unsustainably high level of growth given the stage of their development then? Is 5% just unrealistic and they should be looking at 2.5%?
Yes, because basically they don't set kind of 5-year growth targets like they used to. It's now only done kind of year to year. But basically, if you set an unrealistic growth target, and we can kind of calculate what trend growth is by looking at growth of the labour force, growth of the capital stock, what we call total factor productivity, slightly nerdy term, not really measurable, but we know that China, other countries too, that China's basically run out of total factor productivity. So the potential growth rate in China probably is no more than about 3%. So if you set 5% and you do things to get to 5%, you're going to create resource misallocation. You're going to have lots of high-speed trains going to places that nobody travels to. You're going to have lots of empty apartment buildings and office blocks, kind of things that you see like all the time.
Yeah, I was quite upset about this because I know that people use copper as a proxy for Chinese growth. And I was hoping there was going to be a big stimulus and that would boost the price of copper. And it lasted about 2 weeks, I think.
You're saying this because you have a copper portfolio, don't you? Copper miners.
I'm talking my own book, of course.
Well, maybe the Chinese aren't the only ones who are stockpiling it, Romy.
Yeah, maybe that's the problem. But, let's just hope that President Xi's going to do a big stimulus program because my portfolio really needs it.
I'll keep my fingers crossed for you.
Well, that was brilliant, George. Thank you so much for joining us. And any other books in the pipeline or anything you want to talk about in terms of the very many books which you've written about economics in the past?
Yeah, thanks very much, both of you. I'm not in the process of writing any new books at the moment, but I do still write quite a lot. People are interested, they can go to my website, which is www.georgemagnus.com. And everything I write's in the public domain is recorded there, including some video clips and interviews and so on and so forth.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. And let's just hope that things do pan out for China and our relationship with China, because it was quite depressing actually talking about some of the potential outcomes.
Yeah, we need it to go well for the world. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.